Welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber. Just like last year, we had the fortunate opportunity to sit down with Mikko from WithSecure and talk again about what we learned at RSA this year. Mikko, thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me. Almost at the same place. We're at Marquee, right next to Moscone Center, exactly like we did a year ago.
Like maybe 5 meters in the over that direction we sat last year. And it was a great conversation last year. And I think the thing that I want to start off with is exactly the same thing that I started with last year. What did we learn?
Well, we learned that there is a lot of hype in the industry still about AI. It continues to be the main topic. We had zero trust as the main topic for maybe 2 years. Since last year, it's been AI, generative AI in particular, and it continues to be the main thing. And it's not just hype. There's very real things happening. Last year, there were zero discoveries of vulnerabilities made completely by large language models hands-free. Now we have more than 10. So it's happening, and it's happening faster than we think, faster than I thought.
So what kind of discoveries are we talking about here?
Talking about large language models which are given access to source code, and given the task that, go and find bugs. Out of the bugs that you'll be able to find from this source code, find the bugs which are remotely exploitable, then go and write the code to exploit it.
But the bugs that are remotely exploitable, we're going on the assumption that this would be in an application that is internet facing and is, let's say, internet accessible, network connection, all of that stuff.
For example, some of the 0 days which have been found have been from browsers. Okay. So, applications like that. And the good news is, out of the ones that we know of, they've all been found either by bug bounty hunters or by security companies like Google Security or Expo or Crossbow, companies which find these to report them responsibly so they get fixed. And that's great. I mean, this is improving security. However, some of these vary me a little bit. So, for example, I know one guy in Finland who used to work at WithSecure who is now going solo. He's basically earning his living with bug bounties. And he's found several 0 days with open source large language models like Kren and DeepSeek. And if he can do it, one guy with one computer, we want NVIDIA GPU, he can do. A lot of other people can do it as well. And not all of those people will be the good guys or bug bounty hunters or security companies. And that's the thing that worries me. However, I'm not aware, and I didn't hear during RSA about any discovery where we would know that attackers would have found 0-day vulnerabilities with generative AI.
So I want to come back to that in a second, because that brings me to something that you and I have talked about before as who gains the advantage with AI, the attacker or the defender. But before we get to that, I want to ask a little bit more to the extent that we know, and I can imagine we don't know all the details because I'm sure some of these companies are being kind of secretive about how they used LLMs to find these things. Was there any kind of guidance or knowledge shared about, hey, if you want to use an LLM to find the vulnerability, this is how you start the process, or these are the kinds of prompts that you give?
This is a brand new research area. So I think everybody's just experimenting different things and seeing just what sticks. I know that some of these 0 days found by this solo researcher in Finland, they've basically been fuzzing with LLMs. So use different fuzzing technologies, try all possible kinds of input to everything where you can input in and just try to crash the system. Once you're able to crash it, then the large language model and the framework around it will try to figure out why it crashed and then weaponize, the part of code. Write the exploit to crash it the right way so you get code execution.
So if you say, let's say, just taking fuzzing as an example, so just to kind of make it concrete for the audience, right? So a fuzzing technique is if you have a piece of code that has some kind of input that should be an integer between 1 and 100, you would say, well, what happens when I send -1? What happens when I send ABC? What happens when I send pi, E, some, 2 divided by 3 or some kind of thing that is not really following the thing,
which wasn't designed.
Right. And not a predictable input, right? And so
the way I understand that the fuzzing that was used in here was fuzzing different image formats. Obviously browsers, and we're speaking about browsers here, they have to be able to render different images, and image formats can be pretty complicated. You can imagine that they would work fine when you send a normal JPEG into it, but then you take a 10 terabyte JPEG with really weird structures, and you see what happens. And in some cases, you end up with crashes. And when you end up with crashes, in some cases, you can use those to gain access to the system.
So I can totally see that being the case. I think images in image files are actually kind of interesting, because I think one of the things a lot of people don't understand is that some image files are binary and some image files are actually text files that get kind of rendered by the software that displays them to you. SVG. I think Bitmap is also one of these, if I remember right, but super old school, showing our age a little bit. But yeah, so that's really interesting. Okay, so the question that is, I think, on some minds, and I've looked at one example not too long ago of somebody who used an LLM to win a capture the flag exercise, was that there is a little bit of a open question around, do you go more prescriptive with your prompts, or do you actually go less prescriptive with your prompts and let the LLM try to reason out a way to fuzz on its own? And do we know anything about that yet, about what some of the techniques that have worked to find these problems, or we don't know yet?
That's the thing that these companies and individuals who successfully been able to do this so far, they're keeping the lid on a little bit. Of course, this is very valuable information. Anyway, I want to be, making groundbreaking new research, and it's a business advantage companies in here. So there's a lot of development going on, but we don't have a full visibility on what's really happening.
Yeah. And it's funny because, there was a lot of talk when generative AI started being able to, let's say, develop reasonable running code. And you would hear these things like, well, we're not going to have software engineers in the future. We're going to have prompt engineers. And that's an actual example of prompt engineering, is figuring out the right way to give it the requirements and the criteria and the instructions to develop the thing that you're looking for.
Sure. And then, of course, the next step after using large language models to fuzz code or look at the source code and find the bugs, is that you just give a binary, an exe, and reverse engineer this binary, figure out how it works, call the bugs, and that's going to be possible as well. Probably it's going to take a while, but I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, there's another thing around this that I think is kind of interesting, which is, we talked about source code, we talk about binaries, APIs have also been in that, and there's even a company that I can't remember the name now, and I feel ashamed because I've given this talk a few times recently, but there are companies specializing in building LLMs to write code specifically to create or consume APIs. So a very narrow use case, but it actually unlocks a ton of functionality. If you think about, APIs as this thing that I could take 10 APIs and stitch together a piece of software or a service out of them. So yeah, a lot of room. To your point, a lot of very valuable information in being able to do this right. I want to come back to that question that I said. So we've talked about how whoever gets the advantage is whoever kind of embraces it first, learns how to master it first, and it being AI, obviously. Do you feel like the defenders have now understood this and are actually charging ahead in a meaningful way? Yes, we're going to use LLMs and we're going to use them in meaningful ways.
I would say yes, and I think defenders are in the lead, quite clearly in the lead at this stage, and that's something we rarely see. Quite often when we have new developments, we see the attackers always use the new technology first. For example, cryptocurrencies. A great example. The first time I heard about Bitcoin was when it was already being used in rogue mining. So, which is really telling that I follow technology pretty carefully, and I hadn't heard about blockchain at all until I ran into malware, which was mining already. So this is the rare exception. There's much more things that are being done by the good guys with generative AI than by the bad guys. Now, bad guys are moving. We are seeing, of course, we've seen deepfake attacks, especially consumer targeting deepfake attacks for quite a while. We've seen political attacks. Yeah. We've seen automation of consumer scams, especially romance scams, which are really heavy scams to pull off. Might take weeks or months to nurture.
A lot of the rushed relationship building and very human-like interactions. And historically, they were done by humans, right?
Exactly. So, which means one scammer could only scam one person, or maybe two or three.
Sure.
But with LLMs, you can scam 100,000 at the same time, all languages. Yeah. And this is already happening. And this is really worrying. But frankly, big part of the generative AI attacks we've seen have been targeting consumers. And of course, in a place like RSA, this is not really about that. This is about enterprise security, corporate security, and business-to-business solutions. There's one gang in the ransomware space that I know of, which we believe is using generative AI, not just to help them write the code for their ransomware malware, but also to run the campaigns. And
Okay.
interestingly,
And when we say run the campaigns, you don't mean just, let's say, like write the emails that, the phishing emails to get the initial access credentials and things like that.
no, what I mean is to react to defenders.
Okay.
So continually monitor how defenders are blocking or detecting their attack and then react immediately at machine speed. So
Okay.
basic example, ransomware needs a control server on some IP address and it gets blocked. So it automatically detects, hey, we're getting blocked. Let's change the IP address. Let's change the domain.
Yep.
Let's recompile the binary. Let's avoid detection. And this, again, used to be done by humans at human speed. Now they are reacting so quickly that it seems to be automated. And, and this is the thing we've been waiting for. It seems to be happening. And the interesting thing, I'm referring to a group called FunkSec. And it seems to be from Africa.
Interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah, it's not the parts of the world that we've heard about ransomware gangs in the past. We hear about 409 and the Nigerian scammers and so on. But
BEC and CEO scams, a lot of scams coming from Africa, but ransomware really hasn't been
quite new. No, that's been Eastern Europe, that's been Asia, that's been Middle East a little bit. But yeah, that's really interesting.
When you think about the wisdom that cyber criminals come from geographical areas where you have a lot of people with skills but without opportunities, and of course Africa would also fit this description.
Yeah. I mean, this is, ironically, not to get super geopolitical for a second, but when we think about, the leading causes of immigration and all the political friction that it creates, it primarily comes down to exactly the factor that you said. You have a lot of people with skills but without economic opportunity. Largely speaking, my personal opinion is people leave for better opportunities and better lives for themselves, their children, and their families. On the geopolitical side, what were some of the themes that we had here at the event this year?
Well, one thing which several keynote panels touched upon was North Korea, and especially the North Korean remote workers. So this is something that a lot of companies are worried about. It's a bigger problem than we've realized. This has been happening a lot. So the problem in itself is that North Korea, the government of North Korea, tries to get their people inside US-based technology companies to work as coders.
Yeah.
And there seems to be two different reasons for this. Number one, simply to get money into the most sanctioned government into the world. Tech developers in Silicon Valley companies make a lot of money, so they get money in. And then the bigger worry, which hasn't been happening as much, but what creates a lot of anxiety here, is that they gain access
into companies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a little bit surprisingly, it seems that they haven't been using that too much. They haven't been stealing a lot of information. They clearly so far have just been making money by, posing as a remote worker, typically from Poland or some Asian country or somewhere over there.
Yeah.
And they might even have they've hired people to physically come to a job interview claiming to be the person, but it's just an actor, basically.
Yeah. We had one of these ourselves and not first year of existence. Yeah. We have a blog post up about it. You can find it. We interviewed a North Korean hacker. And, the backstory that we were given, by the way, was a half Irish, half Japanese person who had primarily grown up in Japan. That's why their English wasn't perfect. And that's why they looked Asian, was because of the mixed heritage. And, a completely believable backstory and a fake address in Ireland. We were actually given the resume by a recruiter who recommended the person to us because they did what the recruiter does. They scan the CV. They look for the particular skills that are in the job description, and they do a very introductory phone call just to make sure it's a real person. And, it says you have 5 years of Python. Yes, I have 5 years of Python. Awesome. It says you have 2 years of API development. Yes, I have, and came to us and said, hey, this really sounds like a good fit. It's only through the job interview process itself that we started to get a little bit skeptical. There were a lot of things. I won't go through all of it because that's a long post, but I'm curious when you say it's happening more than we knew about, because at the time, this was 2022 for us. We weren't the only company by any means. And then, last year, KnowBe4 actually admitted that they hired somebody and they shared their experience. We shared ours, etc. When you say it's a bigger problem than we know about, how do we know and what do we know?
Well, I'm quoting FBI here.
Okay.
From one of the panels. That's what they said. They believe it's much more rampant, that there's more of these cases happening. They get more and more reports of this. So they are much worried that there's an underreporting of this. All of these get caught. it's a big problem. And they were half jokingly recommending to ask the questions from the applicants. So, hey, how fat is Kim Jong-un?
I heard this one, yeah.
Or something like that. And I just look for marks or telltale signs. One of the panel members said that they had an interviewee from Poland who couldn't pronounce his own name. So sometimes it is fairly easy to point the evidence if you're just not looking for it. But this clearly is something that is happening a lot and is worrying a lot of companies, tech sector here in US.
Yeah, we've had a couple of other not interviews, but resumes over the years since then. And now we're very sensitive to it after that initial experience. And again, check our blog for about it. We'll maybe reshare on our social with this podcast posting. But now we watch out for that stuff. We've had a few more resumes since then that looked very fake. And there's a few signs of that you can look for as well. Okay. So that's the North Korea side. Anything else on the geopolitical side that were particular themes?
Well, Russia, of course, is there. I didn't really see Chris Kretz, of course, who very publicly had his security clearance
revoked
by President Trump, has been very vocal about this, and he's been pretty visible here. He actually told in one of the panels that he was hosting that he wasn't going to come to RSA at all because of what was happening. But then the chairman of RSA Conference convinced him to come, and I'm happy he was here. He received a standing ovation in one of the panels when he was discussing about the problems he's been facing, because he used to be head of CISA, and he was fired by a tweet in the last Trump administration.
Right.
And in this Trump administration, he had his security clearance stripped, and then he left Sentinel-1, where he was
working. Yeah,
it was working. They're not just an advisor, but actually working. He was original advisor, and he wrote an open letter about how he has to pick this fight alone. It's sort of fight between Sentinel-1 and the administration, for AP and him, or the administration. Another interesting thing about geopolitics was that Dmitry Alperovich, when he was being interviewed in one of the keynotes,
former CTO of CrowdStrike, for those who don't know.
Yeah, and founder. He was a member of the CSRB, that the Cyber Safety Review Board, which is basically the cyber equivalent of NTSB, which investigates real-world disasters. CSRB was, basically, when Trump administration came into effect, big part of the budget was cut, and the advisory board is no longer there. And I think Dmitry was the vice chairman. He's no longer in that position. And I was sort of expecting some sort of commentary or criticism from Dmitry on Trump, and he had nothing. He was actually fairly positive about the shifts and changes underway right now in the United States, which I wasn't really expecting. And I think the audience was also a little bit surprised about how Trump administration got no criticism from Dmitry Alperovich at all.
Interesting. And were some of the things that he was, let's say, complimenting, I don't know if complimenting is too generous, but some of the things that he was kind of pointing out as positive points around the Trump administration causing other companies to invest more in things like national defense and cyber defense, or was there any specifics?
He said there's a lot of things that haven't been working. It's okay to, rough things around and, make big changes. And one thing he said in particular, where he actually prefaced it by saying that a lot of people will be probably angry at me for saying this, but he thinks that CISA doesn't need 5,000 people, and maybe 30 would be enough, which is pretty controversial.
Yeah.
But something along those lines. So clearly he's linking back to the big shifts that's been done by the Doge group run by Elon Musk. So, and I'm not disagreeing that there's a lot of spending in big governments, which probably could be used more wisely.
Sure.
But I'm not a fan of the Trump administration at all. And I guess a lot of Europeans aren't fans either.
Sure.
And that's another geopolitical thing that I've run into several times. A lot of European people here in RSA are anxious about how much we can rely on US technology and our partners in USA.
I heard this point a couple of times. And in fact, on Monday, I was at a little side event and there was a panel discussion of a few people from European leadership positions at various companies and investment firms and governmental and non-governmental organizations. And it is very clear that there is not only concerns about, let's say, the reliance on American technology providers, but also around things like data sovereignty and the ability to have the ability to regulate the data of European customers completely. And I think, there are pledges by organizations like Amazon Web Services and so on that, okay, your data is yours no matter what. But then there's a concern that's been lingering in the back of many people's minds, which is like, okay, but when that subpoena or that warrant or whatever comes, will the provider actually uphold their rights, or will they actually give in to the request? I know Apple has been very public and pretty consistent and always upholding the customer's rights to their data privacy. And I think, one of the things around this that some firms have done is just say, okay, look, it's end-to-end encrypted. Even we don't know what's in the data. We have no way of accessing that data no matter what. Probably as a way to make the customer happy and give them some sense of like, hey, doesn't matter. We can't ever reverse engineer it. We can't unencrypt it no matter what.
Which, by the way, isn't true. When Apple says that or Microsoft says that there's no way for us to access that data, the customers are accessing the data from an operating system created by Apple or created by Microsoft. So a long-winded way of saying what I often think about these problems. If you don't trust clouds of Apple or Microsoft, or if you don't trust, Copilot created by Microsoft, I get a lot of questions. Can we really trust Microsoft Copilot and put our corporate secrets in Copilot and ask questions about the data? And what I always tell these companies that, well, it's a Microsoft product. You trust Microsoft already. You run their operating system all the time. If Microsoft would want to steal your secrets, they could have done that 20 years ago.
Sure.
So they do have access to your data if they're willing to break all the rules. Of course, they don't want to break the rules and completely destroy their reputation, destroy their business model.
Yep.
But it's not true they wouldn't have access to all this data. They do, because the original source of the data is the operating system that they've created, and they have remote access to it through these online update systems. So during times of conflict, during times of crisis, it's not completely out of the realm of imagination that operating system manufacturers would use their power to gain access to information on other people's computers.
But if you think about it, to your point about A, I already have trust in the vendor, and B, all of the steps that would have to happen to get to that point, right? So that would assume that they would have to push out a Windows update, for instance, that has a remote access package in it, and you accept that, and they then get the orders, and they then act on the orders. It's a kind of thing where, my father for years had a tattoo. Well, actually all the rest of his life with his blood type on it.
Right.
And it was given to him during elementary school in Utah in the late 1940s or early 1950s. And I always thought, what's the chain of events where this tattoo is useful? It's a Soviet invasion that gets to the point that it gets to Utah, of all places, not high on the target list, and that there are attacks to the level that they're hurting children, and the children are so hurt that they need blood transfusions, and they need blood transfusions so quickly that they need them right there on the spot, can't get to a hospital, and you have the availability of blood, so you could look at the tattoo and say, oh, okay, B positive, get me B positive blood right now. And so I understand what you're saying about, yes, they could get access to the data. I do think maybe the threat model around it is a little bit long, and
I agree, but the point stands. You already trust these vendors.
Yeah.
And if they tell you that, yes, you can send your corporate data to Copilot, we're not going to use it to train anything, we're not going to leak any of that. Can you trust that promise? Yes, you can trust that promise. If they go to break promises, they could have done that in 1,000 different ways. So that's my point. Last point about the geopolitical things I saw. John Fokker of Trellix had a great keynote on day 2 of the event on the big stage. It was great to see a European to give a keynote in RSA. Of course, I'm biased because I did one last year myself, but he had a great talk about Blackbuster. Blackbuster is one of the largest ransomware gangs out of Russia, especially about the leader Oleg, with very interesting details based partially on leaked chats from within the Blackbuster ransomware. And the biggest bombshell really was about the leader of the gang, Oleg, getting arrested in Armenia. These guys, for reasons that are beyond me, regularly leave Russia for a holiday. They might go to Dubai, they might go to Israel, they might go to Armenia. He went to Armenia and he was arrested. And then, based on the leaked chats, representatives of Russian foreign embassy or a Russian foreign ministry flew to Armenia to have meetings with the local law enforcement, and they left back to Russia with Oleg. And he's now a free man in Russia. And inside the chats, the internal chat of this crime group, Oleg says to the other gang members when he's back that, yeah, well, number one wants me protected.
Yeah.
And we don't really know what that means, but of course everybody thinks he's referring to President Putin. Is that true? Can we trust those chats? We don't know any of that. But maybe it's plausible. Maybe it's possible.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it's interesting. So whenever we get these references that, Russia protects cyber criminals who attack Russia's enemies, they target companies and entities and governments outside of Russia, maybe that is the case. And maybe it goes all the way to the top. Who knows?
Fair enough. Okay, that's the geopolitical side. We've covered that. We've covered some of the AI and AI vulnerability research and a few other things. What else? Anything else that was particularly kind of interesting and exciting?
Not really exciting, but it's amazing how big RSA is.
Yeah.
45,000 people. The expo is just huge. 500 companies I've never heard of, plus 1,000 companies I have heard of. It's just amazing. This industry is a real massive industry and just keeps expanding to new directions.
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier, I've been giving this talk recently around a particular topic, and that topic is actually the development and securing of new technologies. And one of the key points that I make in this presentation is that typically every new technology brings a new set of risks and a new threat model with it. And usually the existing tooling doesn't cover that new set of threats. And so if you think about, the 500 companies that you've never heard of, well, yeah, that's because we're using new technologies. Right now it's AI, but actually it's been new stuff continuously for the last 10 years. And we think about these big shifts like cloud, like SaaS, like whatever, but there are also little shifts that support and enable those technologies continuously. And so you have, kind of little niches opening up and little new technologies here and there, and all of them bring in interesting new risks in many different ways.
And it's great that the solutions to these problems are coming from new companies, new startups, not just the existing large players, because that's where innovation lives. It doesn't live in these huge companies. It lives in new companies with new, fresh ideas.
I think by and large, that is 100% true. Awesome. So that's the state of the industry. That's some of the things that we've seen. Any top tips for people who are thinking about coming next year?
Bring good shoes.
Yeah, we hear that one all the time.
Yeah, it's really funny when I look at my steps on my iPhone, how many steps I've taken throughout the year. I have 2 peaks, which are clearly high.
RSA and Black Hat.
RSA and Black Hat. It's amazing how much you walk around in these things. And of course, come a day earlier than you think would be necessary, especially if you come from Europe, from Finland to San Francisco, 10-hour time difference. It's killer. So give yourself some time to recover.
Yeah, I agree. And also, look, there's some great tourist stuff to do here in San Francisco. There's some good food. There's some good friends. I always find one of the things, and I kind of joke with my wife about this. I worked in cybersecurity, total of about 20 years in my career. I took a couple of years where I really focused much more on the IT side, a little bit of data stuff that I did as well before kind of coming back into cybersecurity. And the one thing I say to my wife is, because she asks, you go to this conference, she's like, how many sessions did you go to? How many talks did you attend? And actually this year, the answer for me was 0. And it's been that way for the last couple of years, but the connections that you make, the side conversations that you have are very valuable. And the other thing that I always find is interesting working in cybersecurity, my hug count at every conference is higher than anywhere else that I've ever worked. And the sense of community and the sense of kind of shared mission, because, we're all on the defender side here at this conference. We're all trying to help our customers have the best security. I don't think that I've ever seen a vendor that wanted to sell somebody a piece of vaporware or something that didn't actually solve a problem. I have seen pieces of software that weren't as effective as other pieces of software. Sure, that kind of thing happens, right? But I've never seen any malintent. I've never seen anybody who wasn't genuinely working on building something interesting because they were trying to solve a problem for the customer. And that is something that I really admire about the space.
In the end, individuals and companies working in cybersecurity are in this business to help the ones who need help.
Yeah.
Certainly, this is a business. Companies, they need to make a profit. But
Sure.
in the end, we use our expertise to help the people who need our help.
Yeah.
That feels good.
And that does feel good. And it's something that I think I saw you talking in Australia, if I remember right, where you thanked the audience for their contributions and the work that they do, because it is very often a thankless job. It's the kind of job where everybody takes you for granted day after day after day until something goes wrong.
Right.
And then it's not generally a thank you for your service. It's a, hey, what happened? What did you guys do?
When you prevent a disaster, no one's gonna know.
Right.
So thank you to people who spend their time and expertise to help prevent the disasters.
And thank you for taking the time to join us. And thank you to our audience for watching this episode of Modern Cyber or listening. Remember to stay tuned for the next one. If you've got any topics you want us to cover, if you've got somebody you think should come on the show, just reach out. We're happy to have you. Talk to you next time.